So Ori and the Blind Forest was a success when it launched in 2015. The game was described as being profitable by both Moon Studios and Microsoft, and Ori proved popular among critics and fans. So much so that Ori and Sign appeared as guest characters in the Super Smash Bros. Styled fighter Rivals of Aether. Given the success of the first game, many expected a sequel to follow, and indeed, a sequel was developed. 5 years after the release of Ori and the Blind Forest, a sequel would be released titled Ori and the Will of the Wisps. But first, some history. Development for Will of the Wisps began sometime after the release of Blind Forest, though when exactly is unclear. However, the team stated that their goal was to increase the scale and scope of the sequel, stating that Will of the Wisps should be to Blind Forest what Super Mario Bros. 3 was to Super Mario Bros. 1. And since Sign had been returned to the Spirit Tree in the first game, the team wanted to experiment with different forms of combat, namely melee combat with aspects of the original projectile gameplay still intact. At E3 2017, over 2 years after the release of Blind Forest, the sequel was revealed to be in development, with its title also being revealed. The game was originally planned for a 2019 release, but it was delayed to February of 2020, eventually being pushed back an extra month to March. The game launched on Xbox One and PC on March 11, 2020, approximately 5 years after the release of its predecessor, with a Nintendo Switch version being released in September of the same year. Like before, I'll be reviewing the Xbox One version, but I'll once again be discussing the Nintendo Switch version later on. The story begins once more in the Forest of Nibel. Ori, Naru, and Gumo live together peacefully, now welcoming a new addition to their family, Kuro's remaining owlet, whom they decide to name Ku. Time passes and Ku begins to grow, with her eventually wishing to fly but finds herself unable to due to an injured wing. Ori, however, is determined to help her and retrieves Kuro's feather, having kept it from the last adventure. With Gumo's help, they use string to attach the feather to Ku's wing, which allows her to finally take to the sky, with Ori joining her. The flight takes them off of the island of Nibel and onto a neighboring island known as Niwen. The flight is initially without issue, but they soon find themselves in the middle of a storm on Niwen. This causes Kuro's feather to dislodge itself from Ku's wing, and the two are separated. Ori eventually encounters the island's inhabitants known as the Moki, who tell Ori to seek out Quolock, the guardian of the marsh, as Quolock will know where Ku is located. Ori manages to find Quolock, who tells them that Ku fell into the Silent Woods, a heavily decayed part of the forest that also serves as a graveyard for the owls that once lived there. To reach the Silent Woods, Quolock tells Ori that they must first clean the waters of the forest by reactivating the wheels of the wellspring to the west. Quolock also gives Ori the voice of the forest, a small orb of light that will help guide them on their journey. Ori manages to get the waters flowing once more, all while avoiding this creature simply known as the Foul Presence, and the reason why the water wheels cease turning. Quolock then tells Ori that passage to the Silent Woods is now possible, but to be wary as those woods are home to a creature that the Moki refer to as Shriek. Ori makes their way through the woods and reunites with Ku. However, the reunion is cut short by the appearance of Shriek, a large owl covered in the same stone as the Decay. The two manage to evade her for a time, but Shriek eventually catches up, separating them again. Ku tries to help Ori but is attacked by Shriek, putting the small owl on death's door. The voice of the forest uses what power it has to keep Ku alive, but time is limited. Quolock tells Ori that to save Ku, the light of the Spirit Willow must be restored. Its voice already with Ori, they must now venture through Niwen to locate the wisps that make up the light. The memory located in Bower's Reach, its eyes in Moldwood Depths, its strength in the Luma Pools, and finally its heart inside the Wind-Torn Ruins. Ori manages to locate each wisp, all while avoiding Shriek, who is intent on destroying them. After obtaining the final wisp inside the Wind-Torn Ruins, the wisps combine to form Seer, the light of the Spirit Willow. On their way back through the feeding grounds, the two are ambushed by Shriek once again, but is repelled by Seer's light and flees. Seer is returned to the Spirit Willow, who states that its time as the Guardian of the Forest has passed and that a new Guardian must take its place. To save Niwen and Ku, Ori must become the new Guardian of the Forest by merging with Seer. But before they can do so, Shriek attacks one final time, incapacitating Seer and engaging Ori in battle. Ori manages to defeat Shriek and merges with Seer, saving both Niwen and Ku. Shriek crashes in the Silent Woods and nestles under the wings of her family's husks, succumbing to her injuries quietly. Naru and Gumo arrive in time to see Ku revived, along with her wing being fully healed. All gather to mourn the apparent loss of Ori until a sprout emerges where Ori and Seer merged. The years pass as Ori's tree grows. Ku and Gumo appear to have set out on their own, and Naru seemingly passes away peacefully. A spirit leaf is shown growing on the branches of the tree as it flies away, a new spirit to emerge, just as Ori had years ago. Once again, I find the story well done. One major difference between this game and the previous one is the inclusion of more dialogue. Where it was used a bit more sparingly in Blind Forest, it's used much more frequently here, due to this game having more characters. And like previously, the Spirit Tree does narrate specific parts of the story, but as the ending reveals, the narrator is not the Spirit Tree of Nibel, but rather the Spirit Tree that Ori became, meaning that Ori is narrating their own story. Despite having more dialogue though, the game still makes excellent use of the environment and its characters' facial and body language to help tell the story. The animation for the characters especially is superb and really tells you what that character is feeling at that moment, and it leads to some truly great moments. Much like Kuro, Shriek is presented as a sympathetic villain of sorts, as flashbacks show that she grew up orphaned and was always alone and rejected, becoming what she is now. Bitter and filled with hate and anger, and she can't bring herself to accept any change in that regard. For instance, when Seer defends Ori from her, Ori stops Seer from attacking Shriek further, instead offering her a hand in friendship, despite what Shriek had done to Ku. But Shriek flies off instead, unable to accept warmth from anyone at this point, making it clear that unlike Kuro, Shriek is beyond hope. And admittedly, while I don't dislike the ending to this game, I was hoping for a happier ending to this story. It's honestly sad seeing these characters either move on or pass on. I realize that not every game can have a happy ending, and that not every game has a happy ending. I can at least respect the decision even if I don't necessarily agree with it. As is though, the game's story as a whole is fine. The gameplay in Ori and the Will of the Wisps is once again that of the Metroidvania style. Once again, it's a platforming adventure game with a large emphasis on exploration. Much like the first game, each area has something for Ori to discover that will improve their chance of surviving in this new land. And the hazards that Ori must contend with are more or less the same as the first game, so in that regard, not much has changed. However, one of the biggest differences between the two games is the combat system. Melee combat is introduced in this title, with Ori gaining access to two forms of weaponry to help them brave the dangers of this new land, the Spirit Edge and the Spirit Smash. The Spirit Edge is a sword of light that Ori acquires early in the adventure. While dealing a relatively low amount of damage, it's able to strike in very quick succession, which makes it an overall reliable weapon. While only possessing one real combination of attacks, it can also be swung upward, striking at enemies above Ori, or when in the air, thrust downward to attack enemies below. The Spirit Smash is quite the opposite. A massive hammer, its attack speed is very slow, but it makes up for this with raw power and is even capable of breaking through enemy defenses such as hard shells or shields. Like the Spirit Edge, it can be swung upwards, but it can also be swung down for a mighty blow. And if attempting to perform a downward attack while in the air, the attack doubles as the stomp attack from the first game, serving the same purposes. While the Spirit Flame can no longer be used, Ori has gained access to new ranged abilities to face enemies from afar. The Spirit Arc, Spike, the Spirit Star, the Light Burst making its return from Blind Forest, and finally Sentry, somewhat serving the function of Spirit Flame. The sheer number of options Ori has for dealing with threats in this game certainly makes them far more versatile than in the previous adventure and allows for multiple different approaches to combat situations. It makes it so you can essentially use one approach on its own or use a combination of both ranged and melee attacks to achieve the most damage possible. So it's all about figuring out which approach suits your style of play. And the game I find does a pretty good job of making sure that most attacks are viable in any given situation. The ability tree from Blind Forest is no longer present in this title. Replacing this system are the Spirit Shards, pieces of light that grant Ori either a passive ability or augment other abilities. Some of these abilities can range from granting Ori a triple jump to granting them more life and energy cells, or even making the game more difficult. All of these shards have some form of use, so it's all a matter of figuring out which shards better suit your playstyle. Also, unlike the last game where abilities were automatically equipped upon receiving them, many of Ori's abilities now have to be assigned to either X, Y, or B by accessing the ability wheel and then changing abilities from there. So with this, only 3 abilities can be assigned at one time. This change is fine because of how many abilities exist in this game compared to Blind Forest, but depending on the situation, it can lead to pauses in the action to switch over to the appropriate ability. Granted, it doesn't take very long to do, but it can be a bit of a pace breaker. Besides Spirit Shards, many items are scattered throughout Niwen for Ori to discover. Like last time, you'll often find Spirit Light, but other times you can find life and energy cell fragments or even items to complete side quests. More on this later. Life and energy cells are no longer full cells, but rather fragments. So now, in order to complete a full cell, you need to find 2 fragments of either cell. And ability cells are no longer present since the ability tree isn't either. Much like Nibel, Niwen has a number of ancestral trees for Ori to locate and gain new abilities from. This can range from new abilities like the Spirit Edge and Spirit Arc, to familiar ones such as Bash and Light Burst. Like before, most abilities are used for exploration, but some do have their uses beyond that. For instance, Swim Dash allows Ori to dash while underwater to swim faster, but it also allows Ori to jump out of the water to greater heights. But it also doubles as an attack. And the same applies to the Burrow ability, which allows Ori to tunnel under sand or snow. However, one ability that sadly doesn't return in this title is the Soul Link, so the convenience of being able to save anywhere is no longer present. Because of this though, Spirit Wells are a bit more plentiful than last time, and the game does a good job of autosaving quite often. So while I prefer the ability to save anywhere at any time, this is a good compromise. Like Nibel, Niwen has multiple areas for Ori to explore. Inkwater Marsh, Quolox Hollow, Silent Woods, the Luma Pools, the Windswept Wastes, the Wind-Torn Ruins, the Wellspring Glades, the Wellspring, Moldwood Depths, Bower's Reach, and finally the Willow's End. Most of these areas are quite large and have their own challenges to overcome. For instance, Moldwood Depths is shrouded in darkness that will kill Ori if they linger within it for too long. So at first, Ori has to use these fireflies to light certain areas, but after gaining the Flash ability, no longer needs them, assuming they have the energy to power the ability. And Windswept Waste is covered in sand, so many of its challenges involve effective use of the Burrow ability. Once again, I think each area of this game is well designed and I enjoy the challenges that they offer, and Ori's controls are just as smooth and responsive as they were previously. Several major changes were implemented in this game, such as NPCs and side quests. Throughout the game, you'll encounter various characters. Most of the time, you'll encounter the Moki, friendly lemur-like creatures, but other times you'll encounter someone a bit more interesting, such as the Wanderer Talk or the Cartographer Lupo. After entering the Wellspring Glades, you can also meet other characters, and quite a number of them offer side quests in exchange for a reward. What I like about these side quests is that they actually have impact on the game. For instance, by finding Gorlek ore and giving it to Grom, he will rebuild the glades, which allows for access to new areas and unlocks new NPCs for additional side quests. And by giving Mysterious Seeds to Tully, it grants easier access to other locations in the area. Now, because ability points no longer exist, Spirit Light now serves as currency. Serving as vendors in this game are Lupo, Ophir, and Twillin. Lupo can generally be found in each area of the game and offers you a map at a modest price. Ophir and Twillin are both found in the Wellspring Glades and offer different services. Ophir is a weapons master and sells Ori new attacks such as the Spirit Smash and the Spirit Star, as well as upgrades for each ability that he sells. Meanwhile, Twillin sells Ori different Spirit Shards and Spirit Shard upgrades. It costs quite a lot of Spirit Light to use the services of each of these vendors, but it can be well worth the effort for just how useful the abilities they sell actually are. I like these additions for the most part, but because of how large the map is and where some of these side quests can take you, it can feel like a chore at times. Thankfully, the fast travel ability that you can purchase from Ophir can help alleviate the backtracking, but even with this, it can still take you quite a bit of time to complete all of these side quests. Another big change to the game are boss fights. Among these bosses are the Wolf Howl, the Spider Queen Mora, a mind-controlled Quolock, the Willowstone, and finally Shriek. Each of these fights are actually quite challenging and can take several attempts to defeat. In my opinion, Quolock and Shriek are among the more difficult boss fights. Howl isn't terribly difficult, and some of Mora's attacks can catch you by surprise, but once you figure out her attack patterns, she isn't too bad. This was something that Blind Forest could have used, especially in the case of Kuro, instead opting for escape sequences in place of boss fights. And while the escape sequences are still present in this game and are still quite thrilling to play through, it's nice to have proper boss fights this time around. As far as difficulty goes, much like its predecessor, the game isn't terribly difficult, but much like that game, has moments where it can get a bit frustrating. But it's still perfectly manageable, and once again, the lack of lives really helps in that regard. In regards to presentation, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is even more impressive than Blind Forest in terms of visual quality. Everything is once again filled with such detail and is just stunning to look at. Everything from the environments to the characters just feels so alive, or in the case of the Silent Woods, feels like a truly haunted and forgotten place. And like its predecessor, the frame rate is smooth and the sound design is absolutely phenomenal. Like Blind Forest before, this is a game where I cannot praise the presentation enough. Only mere months after its initial release, Ori and the Will of the Wisps was announced for the Nintendo Switch during the September edition of the Nintendo Direct Mini Partner Showcase, with the game releasing that very same day. Now, in terms of the game itself, everything was left intact, but unlike the Switch version of Blind Forest, this game did suffer some visual downgrades. It's mostly in certain background and foreground objects, but if you've played the Xbox or PC versions beforehand, then it's definitely noticeable. This doesn't take away from the overall experience, however, and even with these graphical compromises, the game still looks quite good and still runs at a mostly consistent 60 frames per second. However, this version does seem to be a bit less stable than the Xbox version from my experience. During my first playthrough on the Switch, the game did stutter at a few points, certain objects took some time to properly load, and I did suffer from a few crashes. Now, none of these issues occurred very often, but it is something that I noticed, so keep this in mind. But even with these issues, Ori and the Will of the Wisps on Switch is still a very enjoyable experience, just one that needs some fixes to improve its performance. Much like its predecessor, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is an amazing game. Everything that the first game did, this game does just as well and even improves upon the original in many ways. The addition of boss fights adds more to the experience, and the addition of NPCs really helps make Niwen feel more alive. But if I had to be honest, even with everything that Will of the Wisps does right, I think I still prefer Blind Forest overall. Don't misunderstand me, Will of the Wisps is fantastic, but looking back, I prefer the more simplistic approach of Blind Forest. Sometimes I feel like less is more, and Will of the Wisps can feel a bit overcrowded at times with just how much there is to do. And in Blind Forest, I felt like I could use every ability in some way, but I don't quite get the same feeling with Will of the Wisps, as I tend not to use many of the abilities because of just how many there are. Keep in mind, much of what I just said could be considered minor grievances, and honestly, none of that takes away from the overall quality of Ori and the Will of the Wisps. While I prefer the approach of Blind Forest, Will of the Wisps is a masterpiece and a worthy sequel to an already amazing game. Now, where the Ori series goes from this point, no one can really say. But I very much look forward to the day that Moon Studios allows us to once again explore this beautiful world that they've created. But until that day comes, there's still plenty more to be seen elsewhere. So until then, take care everyone.